Welcome to episode 111 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about Lonnie Liston Smith's album with his band The Cosmic Echoes from 1975, Expansions, with its excellent, this is the first pressing by the way, excellent cover art put out on Flying Dutchman, which of course was the label started by Bob Thiele, the legendary producer who had done so much work with John Coltrane in the 1960s. So this is jazz funk par excellence, but it is still jazz funk that has its feet squarely grounded in jazz. This is not reflective of parts of that genre which started to verge so far into R&B that jazz purists got turned off. There's tons of jazz here for jazz lovers, but this is very clearly moving in a funk direction and indicative of where Lonnie Liston Smith was going to go in the coming years to very good effect. Just a reminder, if you like what I'm doing here, please do subscribe. Thanks. So Lonnie Liston Smith, not of course to be confused with Dr. Lonnie Smith, a contemporaneous jazz funk player, was born in Richmond, Virginia, but he cut his teeth playing jazz in New York. His first big break comes in the mid-1960s when he gets a gig with Roland Kirk, the legendary multi-instrumentalist on wind instruments. He plays in a couple of albums with Kirk. He has a short gig with Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, but then he moves into a very fruitful phase of his career as a sideman for Pharoah Sanders, who, in the aftermath of John Coltrane's death in 1967, had continued the trajectory that he'd been pursuing with Coltrane into spiritual jazz. So Smith ends up playing on three legendary albums by Sanders in the late 60s and early 70s, Karma, with The Creator Has a Master Plan, Jewels of Thought, and Thembi, as the band moves through spiritual jazz and flirts with the edges of free jazz. At this time, Smith, who had played acoustic piano all the way through the 1960s, began experimenting with electric keyboards, and it's on Thembi that the first experimentations start to hit vinyl. In the early 70s, he also does some work with Leon Thomas, who is the primary vocalist for Sanders. He does extensive work as a sideman for the saxophonist Gato Barbieri, and he also does a little bit of work with Miles Davis, and some of his work gets released on the Corner by Miles and also the album Big Fun. By 1973, he's played with a ton of the biggest names in the jazz world and has contributed to some legendary albums, and so it's time for him, he feels, to form his own band. He calls them the Cosmic Echoes, and they include his partner in the Pharoah Sanders band, Cecil McBee, on bass, George Barron on soprano and tenor, Joe Beck on guitar, and typically a five-person percussion section, many of whose members would rotate over the coming years. He's signed to Flying Dutchman Records. Now, Flying Dutchman Records is a legendary label in early mid-70s jazz funk with some incredible releases. It's run by Bob Thiele. Thiele, as I mentioned, had been a longtime producer of Coltrane. He'd also produced the Sanders solo output, and of course, Lonnie Liston Smith had played on that. And he was also Gato Barbieri's producer on Impulse as well. So Smith and Thiele were well known to each other, and when Smith let it be known he wanted to form his own band, Thiele was the first to snap him up onto his label. The same year they're signed, in 1973, Smith and the Cosmic Echoes released their debut on Flying Dutchman, Astral Traveling, and that's followed in 1974 by Cosmic Funk. I'll review those albums elsewhere, but there's a very clear progression you can hear as he moves from the spiritual free jazz stuff that he'd been doing with Sanders into very free-flowing, still spiritual, smooth jazz style with very tight, funky bass lines underneath, but not in any way verging too far to the R&B lane. This is still very much jazz. It was in the first two albums, and it is still on this record here. That said, and notwithstanding the fact that Smith is following his own path here, he's not driven by commercial considerations. In his terms, I was trying to expand the consciousness of humanity. As it happens, he's really tapping into the zeitgeist in the mid-70s, and his albums do attract a substantial crossover audience. They sell very well. He gets into a really rich vein of form. There's this album, there's Visions of a New World, and Reflections on a Dream, which all come out in the space of about 18 months to 2 years. They struck a real chord then, and they continue to strike a chord with subsequent generations as they've been sampled and reached back to in the rare groove and acid jazz movements. Signing Smith ended up being very profitable for Thiele as well, because Smith's records sold better than any other Flying Dutchman issues, and the success of his boutique label ends up with RCA buying him out in 1976. The album is, of course, produced by Thiele. All of the songs are by Smith, with one exception, the song Peace, which is a Horace Silver cover. I mentioned that the personnel in the Cosmic Echoes were pretty fluid, and that's very much the case here. You still have Smith on acoustic piano and Fender Rhodes and other electric keyboards. Cecil McBee is still playing bass, but beyond that, it's all change. By this point, Donald Smith, Lonnie's brother, has come in on vocals and flute. Dave Hubbard is playing soprano sax, tenor sax, and alto flute. And there's a five-person rhythm section led by McBee on bass, and it includes Art Gore on the drums, Michael Carvin on percussion, and he also plays clavinet, that quintessential jazz funk instrument, also on the drums in several tracks. Leopoldo Fleming, who played the bongos and other percussion, and Lawrence Killian, who plays congas. As I mentioned, it's funky, smooth soul jazz, but it is fundamentally a jazz album. The nature of Smith's compositions, the nature of his playing is very much on the jazz side of the jazz R&B divide. The rhythm section keeps it funky, and other aspects of the instrumentation which give it that mid-70s flair include, of course, the two different flutes and the clavinet. The title track, Expansion, starts off with percussion, and then we get a fantastic bass riff and bongos, and we are transported right into the heart of 1975. The lyrics, sung by Donald Smith, and this I think is his best performance in this album, are completely indicative of the kind of content that Lonnie Liston Smith would deliver throughout this period. Expand your mind to understand. We all must live in peace to earth. Extend your hand to help the plan of love to all mankind on earth. Expand your mind. Expand your mind. When Donald finishes singing those words, he adds a great flute solo. Then Lonnie has a wonderful Fender Rhodes solo. This is a brilliant song and a real landmark track from the golden era of jazz funk. Desert Night starts with another wicked bass riff under a percussive intro. This song's a little more psychedelic, but I really like it. And over top of all the psychedelia, then you get Lonnie coming in, hammering out a solo with some block chords. You can totally trace the lineage, I think, when you're listening to this, back through his time with Sanders and even back into his time with Coltrane. You can definitely hear that trajectory. The title of the song reflects the inspiration for the song and actually for the album, and indeed for the cover art, which was a whole series of essentially Middle Eastern images which Lonnie was interested in, some dreams he'd been having, and so on. So two very strong songs to start the album. The third song and last song on side one is Summer Days, which is a little bit more eclectic, not quite as compelling, still a good song though. It's essentially, according to Smith, a tribute to the hustle bustle of life in New York during the summer. Side two starts with Voodoo Woman. This has an upbeat keyboard riff and then this high drifting synth line, but overall it's flute, which is actually the main texture of this song. It's really quite beautiful. It's quite ethereal actually. Towards the very end of the song, Dave Hubbard comes in on tenor, and it's a fantastic contrast with the flute. Sadly, as soon as he comes in, the song begins to fade out, and I actually would have loved to have heard much more of that back and forth in the interplay. The next song is Peace, which of course is a cover of a song by the legendary jazz pianist Horace Silver. It's barely recognizable from Silver's original composition. It again has a Donald Smith vocal, and again, like the other vocals in this record, there's a certain kind of wide-eyed, almost naivete about the nature of the lyrics. Donald Smith has a beautiful voice. He's got this superb high tenor, and he has this really interesting kind of elongated vibrato. The trouble is, when you're singing lyrics like, we need peace for our children so they can lead a better life, it's hard to do so in a way which works and doesn't seem a bit kind of ponderously naive. And unfortunately, I don't think he pulls it off. There are some aspects of the song which do redeem it, however. There's some really interesting changes of pace and dynamics between the verses and the choruses. Overall, it's a great piece of music. You just have to find a way not to expect too much of the lyrical content. The next song, Shadows, has a really interesting piece of drumming by Art Gore, a very kind of edgy rhythm, and some really nice sax playing by Hubbard over top of that. Woven into all of that is some really atmospheric work by Lonnie Liston Smith on the Rhodes piano. This is another nice track. The final track has Smith moving to acoustic piano. This is another song with Donald Smith singing, and again, the same kinds of issues are showing up with the lyrics, and I'm starting to find this, towards the end of the record, a little bit syrupy. Summing up Expansions, this is a really good album, particularly if you're looking for that sweet resting point between jazz and funk, which only a few artists were actually really able to nail without falling too far on one side of the fence or the other. Personally, I really like it when jazz artists went all the way over the side of the fence into R&B. I really love all those CTI Kudu releases. I'm a big Grover Washington fan and so on. So those criticisms aren't coming from me. All I'm saying is that there's plenty of jazz on here to satisfy the jazz snobs and the jazz purists. It's not just for funkmeisters. The title track alone makes this album a winner, but there's a whole bunch of good performances on here. There are some great musicians. Donald Smith's vocals don't always contribute as much to the songs in this record as they do to the title track. The last song, My Love, might actually have been better off as an instrumental. While the singing is good, the lack of lyrical subtlety starts to grate as you move on through the record. All that said, this is a really strong effort by Lonnie Liston Smith and his whole band, and for me, this record is worth 4 to 5 stars.